3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff.
This is the Bulova Lunar Pilot, model number 96B258. It was originally created by Bulova as a prototype, but it was used on the Apollo 15 mission, and this watch is my Grail watch. Bulova has recently come out with an updated version of this watch, but today we're going to take a closer look at this original model and why I think now may be a good time to consider it. That is, if you have the wrist for it. Hey everyone, welcome back to Eric's Everyday Watches. As always, if you like this video, if you find it helpful, please do me a favor, hit the like button and consider subscribing. Let me start by saying that I know a lot of people laugh at the idea of a Grail watch that sells for $500 or less. But as I've said before, I believe the value of the watch is not based on price, but rather on the connection that you have with a watch. So in this video, I'm going to share with you why this watch has had such an impact on me. Now, I've always had a thing for pilot watches. The overall style, the quick legibility, all wrapped up in the history of aviation and everything that goes along with that. Names like Chuck Yeager and Amelia Earhart. And how much higher can you take a pilot watch than the moon? Now, there are two main reasons I'm drawn to this watch. The first one is the underdog story, or should I say stories with an S. Starting with Joseph Bulova emigrating to the US, starting a company and being successful at that. Then the fact that Bulova was in a rivalry with Omega, and Omega had a stronghold on supplying watches to NASA, and yet somehow Bulova still managed to get their foot in the door. Now, whether or not there is any truth to the urban myth that $50 may have changed hands between Commander David Scott and a certain ambitious young representative from Bulova looking to score himself in a corner office, there's absolutely no way to know. What we do know, however, is that it's most fortunate indeed that on that Apollo 15 mission back in 1971, when the crystal of Commander David Scott's Omega watch suddenly fell loose, he was fortunate to have one of Bulova's lunar watch prototypes with him. Up there, on the moon. Now, I think we all know what happened there. It's true. Some guys just have all the luck. Now, on that fateful day back when Commander David Scott strapped that Bulova watch to his spacesuit, something else important happened. And here is one of the main reasons why I am so drawn to this watch. In that moment, Commander David Scott, Bulova, and that ambitious young representative who we do not dare speak his name, they made it possible for the everyday working man to also own a moon watch. Because of that moment, all of us everyday working people can also get our foot in the door. Now, with the price of an Omega Speedmaster hovering around $6,000 these days, a price which many of us seems as far out of reach as the dark side of the moon, this version of the Bulova Lunar Pilot typically sells for around $500 US. Now, at the time of this video, you can find this watch available on Amazon for $562 US. I picked mine up about a year ago for 380 Canadian. Canada, eh? There's always been some deals out there when it comes to this watch. And because there's a new version of this watch out now, I think there'll be more deals coming up. Both from retailers looking to move out the old stock, but also from collectors who just want to sell and buy the newer, smaller version. So if this watch is of interest to you and you have a 7-inch wrist or larger, you may want to think about keeping an eye out and considering it. Now, let's get on to the second reason why this watch has appealed to me so much, and that is the watch itself. Now, the most important thing to know about this watch is it is a big boy with a diameter coming in at 45 millimeters, not including the crown. But more importantly than that, on the side of the case, we have a lug-to-lug distance of a whopping 52 millimeters with very little downturn to the lugs. And this is why some people struggle with the original version. Now, I have a 7-inch wrist, and as you can see, it fits. But like I said, it is a big boy. I'll say it again, you are going to need a 7-inch wrist or larger for this watch. Now the case is 316 stainless steel, and this version with the bracelet and the date window has an unusual tri-finish. First off, we have a brushed finish around the bezel, and then we have this satinized or bead blasted finish on the case itself. And that does seem to lend itself to the idea of being a tool watch in space. And finally, we have a high polished finish on the crown and the two leveled pushers. Now, one criticism I've heard of this watch is that the case finish does not match the bracelet. And it would have been a bonus had Bulova come out with a matching bracelet at some point since 2016 when this was introduced. But sadly, that has not happened. On back of the watch, we have one of the nicest case backs I've seen. It is a screw-down case back, which is both a high polished finish as well as the bead blast treatment. And in addition to that, it has depth to it, with the polished ring being embossed as well as the Bulova tuning fork logo. And if that wasn't enough, they also included text printed in black ink. How many times do you see that on a case back? And that text is the Apollo 15 mission info. Now around the perimeter, we find all the usual text: sapphire crystal, stainless steel, high performance quartz, and 50 meters of water resistance. And to all of those naysayers who think 50 meters of water resistance is not enough, I ask, how much water do you think is on the moon? I'm pretty sure 50 meters is more than going to cover it. Now, as I've mentioned, the movement inside is the high precision quartz movement NP20 with an ultra high frequency of 262.144 kilohertz. And that is 8 times greater than the standard quartz, and it is going to be accurate within seconds per year. It is made in Japan and it has 0 joules. Now, you're going to notice this mostly in the movement of the chronograph hand. Now, on the version of this watch that does not have a date window, it is using the same movement, which means you're going to have a ghost position on that watch. Now, regardless of which version you get, the second hand does hack. The crown at the 3 o'clock position is signed with the Bulova tuning fork logo and is approximately 8 millimeters in width and 5 millimeters in depth, which is large, but on a 45 millimeter case, it doesn't appear so. Plus, if you happen to be wearing gloves or, a spacesuit for that matter, then it's probably for the best. It has no crown guards because it is flanked by those levered pushers, and that is a nice and welcome change. Now, this is a simple push-pull crown. Pulling it out to the first position sets the date, and pulling it out to the second position sets the time. Now let's move on to the main attraction of the watch, the dial. In my opinion, it is absolutely stunning. There's just something about that stark black and white color and the depth which is captivating. Starting on the outside, we have a tachymeter printed white on black, and that is found under the sapphire glass. On a side note for all you history buffs, on the original prototype that Commander David Scott used, it read tachometer instead of tachymeter. Both measure speed, but tachometer is almost exclusively used for measuring RPMs of a rotating shaft. Now, inside of that tachymeter, it drops down significantly to the dial. I would estimate this to be a 4.5 millimeter drop. And here is where we find a white per minute track. Moving inside of that, we're going to step back up a couple millimeters to the dial that the indices sit on. This step up allows for some added visual interest, but very subtly. Now those white baton indices are applied and really jump out against the flat black dial. The amount of height that they have to them is probably similar to other watches in truth, but with that stark black and white color scheme, it just helps them to be incredibly legible at a glance. The date at the 4:30 position is printed white on black and blends into the dial. As I mentioned before, not every version has a date window, and if you don't have the date window, then you're going to have a ghost position on the movement. It is a quartz watch, so I'm not sure why anybody would avoid the date window option. The subdials are again inset from the dial. All of the various depths and heights which have been incorporated into this watch makes you wonder if the designer was subtly adding a reference to the rocky terrain found on the moon. That's my take on it anyhow. At the 9 o'clock position, we have a 60-minute timer for the chronograph. At the 3 o'clock position, we have a 1/10 of a second timer. And at the 6 o'clock subdial, we have a running second hand. The levered pushers are not only glove friendly, but I appreciate how they follow the direction of the case itself. Instead of being two large buttons that stand out, this feels much more integrated. Pushing the top button has a satisfying tactile feel along with a soft audible noise to it, and starts the chronograph hand. You'll see that the chronograph hand movement is a result of that high performance quartz and avoids the 1 per second tick we're all so accustomed to seeing. Pushing the bottom lever resets the chronograph hand and makes a full sweep around the dial. The fence post style hands in this watch are a high gloss white color and somehow appear even whiter than the other elements on the dial. The minute hand as well as the chronograph hand is more than long enough and extends all the way past the indices, practically touching the ledge of the tachymeter. The indices, the hands, and the chronograph hand are all loomed on this watch, and in my everyday loom test, I was able to read the time at 5 in the morning. Now topping off that dial, we have a sapphire crystal, which I've heard before described as a top hat. And you can see why, for obvious reasons. It protrudes roughly 2 millimeters from the top of the case and brings the overall thickness of this watch to 14 millimeters. It's unusual, and the obvious concern is chipping. I've been fortunate enough to avoid that fate so far. And interesting enough, I've not heard of people online who've actually chipped this crystal. The bracelet that comes with this watch is a solid link bracelet and 20 millimeters wide at the lugs and 20 millimeters at the clasp. That's right, there's no tapering here whatsoever. It is a butterflied push-button clasp with a milled interior section. As with all butterfly clasps, there are no micro-adjustments, but the bracelet does come with half links for a somewhat better fit. On the clasp, it looks just like any other link, but it is signed with the Bulova tuning fork logo. In my everyday use, I found this to be a quality bracelet. The one downside here, which we've already gone over, is the fact that the brushed finish on the bracelet does not match the bead blast finish on the case. You could say it kind of works since the bezel is brushed and the crown has a high polish and it all kind of goes together in this non-matchy-matchy sort of way. Or you could say, it is what it is, and simply move on. So let's go over the specs for this watch. You get a sapphire crystal, the high-performance quartz NP20 movement. You have a diameter of 45 millimeters, a thickness of 14 millimeters, a lug width of 20 millimeters, and a lug-to-lug distance of 52 millimeters. And finally, let's wrap up by going over the pros and cons. For pros, you have the history of it. It is a legitimate moon watch. Price. You know, I normally don't include price in the pros and cons, but given the fact there's only 2 moon watches, it needs to be mentioned. The aesthetics. I do think this is an absolutely stunning looking watch. Legibility kind of goes along with that stark black and white color scheme. And accuracy. It is going to be accurate within a couple seconds per year. Now for cons, the lug-to-lug distance means it's not going to be wearable for some people. And the finishing is not your traditional matchy-matchy approach. So my final thoughts on this watch is I think this is an absolutely killer watch with one large caveat. Large being the key word in that sentence. This watch does require a 7-inch wrist or bigger, but if it fits and you can pick it up for under the retail price, I would absolutely do so with no hesitation. The Bulova Lunar watch is a piece of history. This has been Eric from Eric's Everyday Watches, reminding you to buy the watch that you love. And don't pay any attention to what anybody else says or thinks. This is your watch collection. If you like this video, if you find it helpful in any way, please do me a favor, hit the like button and consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next video.